We are going to take a journey today as we explore a mother of the Bible and her journey that transpired in her life and how God used her even to bring to us a great prophetic revelation. Now, going back to the time of the Old Testament, we know that in the Old Testament, the society and the structure of the way society functioned was different than the way it functions today. And there are so many variances, of course, that it's hard sometimes for us to relate to what happened back then. But the system back then, as it related to marriage and the family, was that a man would have many wives. This was something that was not only accepted and acknowledged in the Bible, it was actually something in the Old Testament that was legislated as well. And so when we go back and we look, especially in those earlier days of the Bible, throughout the book of Genesis and then later on other books, we discover that that system existed of social order. And so we find some things in the Bible today that are, challenging to us given our outlook and our moral point of view. But that's the way it was back then. In fact, you know that the system, God had set it sort of up like this, that if a brother, you may remember, had another brother, I may have had 10 other brothers, we don't know, and I don't know how all that worked out if you had more than one brother. But what the Bible says, that if you had a brother, that if your brother's wife died, then it was your obligation to take her on as an additional wife to yourself for the purpose of having children. Now, we know that back then, children were extremely important to that society. Today, in our society, there are people many times that just choose not to have children. And we find that perfectly okay, of course. But back then, it was sort of obligatory to have children. It was seen as a tremendous blessing of God to have not just one or two children, but as we've noted in some previous weeks here, to have many children. And so the more children you had, the more it was evidence that God had blessed in your life. So a man that had more than one wife, of course, would have the ability to have more children. And so, therefore, it was seen as a blessing of God. And so we have God saying, okay, if your brother dies, you have to take his wife and you have to have children to raise up children for your dead brother, so that your dead brother would also have descendants. And that's the way that it functioned back then. And so they viewed that as a good thing, as a special thing, and a blessing from God. Now, we understand a different set of morality, and we have to be careful when we look back at the Old Testament. But we understand things today, and by the way, if anyone, husband or wife, if you have one spouse and only one spouse, by the way, that's a good thing. There are some things in life that it's good to have more than one, right? I mean, if you go to the ice cream shop and you only get one scoop of ice cream, there's something wrong with you, right? I mean, and all of us know that if you only have one scoop, you're saying to yourself by the time you get to that bottom of the cone, I should have had that other one. I had mint chocolate chip, but I also wanted Rocky Road. It's okay. That's a great thing. And if ice cream is good for you, that's a blessing of God, right? You're kind of silent. Yeah, it's okay to eat ice cream once in a while. Don't do too much of it. In any case, look, there are no circumstances when having an additional spouse is a good thing. It doesn't make any difference what happened back then. It was bad then too. And we know that from when we look at the Bible record, every time you see a story of these people that had multiple wives, they always had problems. Right? So anyway, but that's the way it was. And so in order to understand the story, we have to put ourselves back in that context. There was a man that had a wife. And then at some point, he got another wife. And we don't know which one, but one of those ladies could have children, and the other one, for some reason, did not have children. Now, with the context that we've just described, you can imagine the enormous social pressure that existed on a woman to have a baby. And if you didn't have a baby, you had let your husband down because now he did not have children, and you had let the whole community down because people could see it was obvious that God was not blessing in your life. And now there was sort of a moral stain on your life because you did not have a baby. And thus we see several times in the Old Testament women pleading and struggling with God, I can't have a child, I need to have a baby. Now, by the way, we know in our world today that it may have been the husband that was the culprit, not the woman. But in any case, we know, this was the feeling of women. I can't have a child. And so immediately, God was seen as the one that had shut the womb of the woman. And therefore, we see these prayers of some of the women in the Old Testament. And this story is exactly like that. And this, by the way, sets the stage for the most significant times and stories that we have in the biblical record. So this guy goes up, as the story starts, to the temple in Shiloh. The temple at that time was not in Jerusalem, but it was more up in central Israel, what we know today as central Israel, on a large platform that you can still walk on today. Now, the tent structure isn't there, of course, but that large platform that was built by the Israelite people in order to erect the tent is still there today. And you can walk around on that platform and see where the original tent structure, after they had crossed over the Jordan River, was set up in the land of Israel. And so this man now came up to the temple, as people often did, in order to come and to have a special time, special sacrifice. And he came up there with his two wives. One wife was happy. The other wife was sad and in despair. One wife had given birth to children. The other wife seemed to be unable to have children. And so this journey up to the temple was not a happy occasion for her. She was going up to the temple where Yahweh was worshipped, yet in her mind, Yahweh, the God of heaven, had shut her womb, and you can imagine what she was thinking all the way up to the temple. It is up. It was in a mountainous area, and it's a climb up to that platform. And all the way there, she was thinking in her mind, we're going up to worship Yahweh, and Yahweh has shut my womb. Why does Yahweh not open my womb and let me have children? So all that time, as she was crying and sorrowful in her heart, walking along the way, they ended up at the temple. And her husband, when it came time to do the sacrifices and to pass the food out and those kind of things, in order to let his wife know that he loved her even though she did not have children, you may remember the story, she received from him twice as much as the other wife. And he said to her, I love you so much. He says, I'm better to you than so many other sons. If you had 10 of them, I'm better. But she did not have peace in her heart because she didn't have children. So she began to weep. The other wife was terribly persecuting her verbally. The Bible doesn't record what she said, but you can sort of fill in the words and imagine yourself. Well, look at you. What sin do you have that God has shut up your womb? Or maybe it's just our husband, you're so ugly, he doesn't like you anyway. We don't know what was said, but we know it was horrible. And the wounds went deep into the heart of Hannah. And so when she arrived at the temple, she was in no mood to worship. But she was in a mood to cast herself down in despair. Here's what the Bible record has to say. But Hannah, he gave a double portion for Hannah. He loved Hannah, but Yahweh had shut up her womb. Her rival provoked her severely to irritate her. Her rival provoked her, therefore she wept and would not even eat. Once again, we can only imagine. You know, people can be so mean to other people, can't they? And you can imagine in a home like this, where you had two rival women and only one husband, how a lot of wounds could be inflicted. And they were being inflicted. And so she arrives there, and she begins to pray. Opens up her heart to Yahweh. And asks Yahweh for the blessing. She was in the bitterness of soul and prayed to Yahweh while she was weeping bitterly. Have you ever prayed to God out of despair? Real, genuine despair. All of us pray to God out of frustration at times. But this woman was entirely emotionally broken. And in the bitterness, the Bible says, she wept bitterly because of the bitterness of her soul. She was sad, she was broken, she was despondent, and she was bitter and angry at God for sealing up her womb. You ever prayed to God like that? It's okay. Sometimes we need to let our heart out to God in despair. And she did. And she vowed a vow in her prayer. And she said, Yahweh of armies, if you will indeed look at the affliction of your servant and remember me. She says, okay, God, I don't know why you've done this to me, but I'm willing to negotiate a deal with you. And she says, God, if you will undo whatever you have done to me. You see, she was blaming God. It may be, and we don't know, it may be that God had done this on purpose. Because God had a special plan that He wanted to perform for His people through the birth of this child that was going to come. But it may have been, as we know, those things happen. Sometimes biology doesn't always function in the immediate way that we expect it to. But whatever the case, she was negotiating with God. If you will, remove from me whatever you have placed on me to keep me from having children. She says, I'll make a deal with you. She vowed a vow and she said, Yahweh of armies, if you will indeed look at the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant, notice her specific prayer. She didn't say, Lord, if you will give me a child. She could have asked for a boy or a girl, but she wanted a boy. Okay, we don't really get this one either because, typically in our society, we don't care as long as the child is healthy, right? And we praise God for that. We have two girls, and it's been back a few years ago. My daughter, who was an adult at the time, she was helping me doing some work around the house. We were painting the outside of the house, a big chore. And anyway, we were lifting some heavy things. And she said to me, she said, Dad, you know, if only I could have been a boy, I would have helped you. You know, she didn't want to be a boy, don't misunderstand. But she was saying, oh, my dad probably needed a boy. I told her, I said, are you kidding me? I said, I wouldn't give you up for 1,000,000 boys. You know, girls are precious. And the boys are precious. But unfortunately, back in that society, the boys were more precious. And so she asked for a boy. She said, oh, boy, I want a boy. Says, then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life. How could she do that? A parent can't, once a child is an adult, they're going to do whatever they want to do, right? But she says, Yahweh, at least in my mind, to the best of my ability, I am giving this child to you for the rest of his life. And no razor shall come on his head. She was setting him aside, special, that is the right thing. And she said then to God, I made this deal with you. If you give me the boy, then I will give him back to you. So she prayed this prayer to God while she was crying. And just bitterly crying. And her lips were moving. But no sound came out. And of course, you know the high priest, Eli, he was over there. And he said, got a drunk woman here, I got to deal with her. Which is kind of interesting in itself. He had two sons that were drunks that terrorized the temple all the time. But yet he decides that he has to go chastise this woman because she was drunk. So he goes over to her and chews her out for being drunk. And Hannah answered him and says, no, my Lord, I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I'm not drunk. He said, I have not been drinking wine or strong drink, but I pour out my soul to Yahweh. Don't consider yourself, your servant, a wicked woman. For I have been speaking out of the abundance of my complaint. That's interesting phraseology, isn't it? She had a complaint against God. You've done this to me, it embarrasses me, and I don't deserve it. She has been speaking out of the abundance of my complaint and my provocation. The provocation was coming from the other wife. And she says, she provokes me all the time. And that's why I'm so sorrowful. And she says, you know, I've been praying this prayer to God, negotiating with him. You know the story. One of the premier famous stories of the Bible. The baby was born. The baby, at some point, baby Samuel, was brought back up to the temple. We don't know at what point that occurred. The Bible just says that when he was weaned, but that doesn't mean what we necessarily think it means today. You know, 18 months and, you know, you're going on to the bottle or something. It just simply means that at some point, probably when he was old enough to sort of start entering into adulthood and out of childhood, he was taken up to the temple. And his mother said to him, now, this is going to be your place of residence because I negotiated a deal with Yahweh. He honored his part, and now I'm going to honor my part. She took him up. And there we know that Samuel became the great leader ultimately and judge of Israel throughout nearly his entire life. The nation of Israel needed him so much, they had evolved into a wicked time. And Samuel brought the attention of the nation back to God and led them with great nobleness. So God had answered her prayer. But then Hannah now when she takes that child up to the temple, she has a second prayer. And this is a prayer different than the first prayer. So we see this mother now praying once again to Yahweh, not with crying in bitterness, but notice how she was praying to Yahweh. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts Yahweh." You know, the first time was, "What's wrong with you? Why have you done this to me?" This time is, "My heart exalts Yahweh. My horn is exalted in Yahweh." And then she proceeds in this prayer that shifts into a prophecy about the coming Messiah. Notice what happens. This may be kind of an interesting prayer for us to look at. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in Yahweh. My horn is exalted," that is my strength. "My mouth is enlarged over my enemies." That one probably escapes us, but it seems to be that in some way my enemies are being devoured or put in their place. "Because I rejoice in your salvation." Notice now two things in this prayer of Hannah. One is that my enemies have been put in their place, and that I have received salvation. Now specifically, she's talking about the other wife. But in a broader sense, this prayer of Hannah, of course, has great application that goes beyond just that particular circumstance. So she says that my enemies have been put in their place, and I rejoice in your salvation. We find that throughout the Bible, throughout the Psalms, and certainly at the end of time. The enemies of God are going to be put in their place, and those that have been harassing the people of God are going to be put in their place, and God's people are going to receive eternal salvation. So we find that thought pattern right here in these early days in this prayer that Hannah prayed. She says, "There is no one as holy as Yahweh, for there is no one besides you, no other gods, nor is there any rock like our God. Don't keep talking exceedingly proudly." She's talking about the other wife. She was saying, you should have shut your mouth, right? Because God has had the last answer here. Look what he did. Don't keep talking exceedingly proudly. Don't let arrogance come out of your mouth. For Yahweh is a God of knowledge. She says, I depended on Yahweh. He answered my prayer. And you, other wife, whoever she was, God has put you in your place. By him, actions are weighed. The vows of the mighty mighty men are broken. Those who stumble are armed with strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread. Those who are hungry are satisfied. Do you notice the contrast? In every one of these things, those that were disadvantaged, it's been turned around now, and those that were arrogant and proud have been put in their place, and God has exalted those that have need. Look, there is nothing different in that than the experience of every Christian. God will always exalt his people. If not in this daily life, certainly at the end of time, at the second coming, Jesus is going to exalt his people. And those that have persecuted them are going to be crushed. And we see that in the prayer that Hannah is praying. Yet the barren has borne 7. She must have had other children. She who has many children languishes. So the other woman languishes, and she says, I've been exalted. Now we may take some exception here to her exalting over her enemy, okay? And we're not going to sort all of that out today. But it is emblematic of what is going to happen at the end of time. God's people go through terrible stress, terrible trouble, and God then sets them free, and God gives them everlasting life. And the others, of course, are destroyed at the end of time. He raises up the poor out of the dust. He lifts up the needy from the dunghill to make them sit with princes and inherit the throne of glory. He will keep the feet of his holy ones. Throughout whatever's coming, God is going to keep the feet of his people. But the wicked shall be put to silence and darkness. Do you see all the end-time implications of this prayer that Hannah prayed? And she even had a glimpse of Messiah. She says, "For no man shall prevail by strength. Those who strive with Yahweh will be broken in pieces." You remember, we just finished the book of Daniel. Remember the stone that was cut out without hands? Remember all the arrogant kingdoms and kings? What did it do? It took them, and the Bible says it ground them into powder, and the God of heaven set up his kingdom. He will thunder against them in the sky. Yahweh will judge the ends of the earth. You see why this is an end-time prophecy. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed, that is the Messiah. So here God gave to Hannah, somewhere in this inspired prayer of hers, God gave Hannah not just a prayer as it related to her particular circumstances, but a prayer that relates to all of us for all periods of time. So we realize now, through the struggle of this mother, and every woman, every mother has her own individual struggles. We know that. This doesn't represent the particular struggle of every mother. Listen, mothers, I don't care what life has been like for you. Maybe overall good, maybe overall bad, but I can guarantee one thing. Every one of you has had struggles, right? Maybe with your children. It's not easy to be a mother. Anybody easy to be a mother? Anybody? It's not easy to be a mother. And Hannah here may not represent your particular struggle. But the way that she does represent you is we see a woman that was willing to take her struggles to God and depend on him to sustain her and to see her through. And I know, mothers, that's where you have been with your lives, and I know that is where you will continue to be. Struggling with God, even though the perplexities seem overwhelming, and know that God somehow is safely going to see you through. And know that God does hear the prayers that you ask. I think it's also wonderful that in the second prayer of this mother, that we, all of us, find ourselves enmeshed in the story of this wonderful mother. Because we see now that her experience broadens beyond herself. And it's experience now that applies to all of us in every circumstance of life and whatever it may be. And that is that God is there. He's willing to hear our complaints, even our anger and our bitterness. And even though we may complain to him, he is still willing, out of his loving kindness, to answer us and to give us the desires of our heart. God is there. He loves each one of us. And from the story of this wonderful mother, we realize that God, no matter the perplexity of life, God is always on our side. Would you stand with me?